Simplifying complex numbers. We have learned previously we cannot take a square root of negative numbers. However, these are simply called complex numbers, and we just need to learn how to deal with them. To simplify complex numbers, we must include the imaginary unit, I. In the case of imaginary numbers, I is going to be equal to the square root of negative 1. So what this means is if you have the square root of a negative number, then all you have to do is break it apart, use our square root rules, and break it apart into negative 1 and then whatever the other number is. Simplify your square root, and then you can replace the square root of negative 1 with the letter I. So let's do some examples to understand what this means. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is we want to split it up. Use the product property of square roots and break it up into the square root of 18 and the square root of negative 1, because negative 1 times 18 is negative 18, so we're not changing anything. And we're talking about square roots here. So when I break it up, I am looking for groups of 2, 9 times 2, and then I can break that up further. Square root of 3, square root of 3, and there is a group of 2 square roots of 3. So what that means is we're going to pull out a 3. So we can simplify 18, square root of 18 to 3 square root of 2, and then don't forget that the square I equals the square root of negative 1. So instead of writing the square root of negative 1, I'm just going to write I. So my final answer simplifies to 3i times the square root of 2. Now generally we don't write anything after a square root, so that's why we move the I before that. And the next one. For this next one, we're going to solve the square root of 64 plus the square root of negative 49. So with this first one, it's easy enough because the square root of 64 is just 8. But the second one, we have the square root of negative 49. So that's going to become the square root of 49 times the square root of negative 1. Okay, and then the square root of 49 we know to be 7. So what we have is 8 plus 7 times the square root of negative 1 is I. So 7i. And we cannot put the 8 and the 7 together because it is not 8i. So just leave it as that. For this next example, we have I cubed. Well, again, we can work backwards. Instead of starting with the square root of a negative number, we're starting with I. That's fine. But we know that I is equal to the square root of negative 1. So if we just replace the I with the square root of negative 1, the square root of negative 1 cubed, what that means is we have 3 of them. So that's going to give me square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1, which is going to give me the square root of negative 1, because negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. So that means we simplify it to simply I. And the last example here, square root of 25. We want to split that up as we did before. So as the square root of 25 times the square root of negative 1, because 25 times negative 1 is negative 25. And when we actually take the square root of 25, we get 5. And the square root of negative 1 we know to be I. So our final answer is 5i. Those are your notes over simplifying complex numbers. Go through the practice problems, make sure that you can do all these different types of examples, and then proceed with your quiz.